There is a letter, not in your Bible, not in the Gospels you have read since childhood, not in any of the writings that were gathered and approved by the councils of the early church. This letter sits outside the canon, in the quiet margins of history, in the dusty archives of ancient texts that were never officially accepted, but were never entirely forgotten either. It is said to have been written by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, the man whose name every Christian hears every Sunday, whose decision sent Jesus of Nazareth to the cross, whose hands, according to the Gospel of Matthew, were publicly washed in an attempt to remove himself from responsibility for what he had just authorized. This letter, preserved in fragments across centuries of Christian tradition, is said to have been addressed to Emperor Tiberius in Rome. And in it, Pilate does something extraordinary. He describes Jesus, not as a criminal, not as a rebel, but as a man who shook him to his core, a man whose face he could not forget, a man whose death was accompanied by phenomena that no Roman governor had ever been asked to explain in an official report. Tonight, we are going to sit with this letter, slowly, carefully, the way you would sit with any document that has survived 2,000 years to reach you. You do not have to decide tonight whether it is authentic in every detail. Scholars have debated its origins for centuries, and the debate will continue long after this video has ended. But the letter itself, the words it contains, the picture it paints, the soul it reveals, is worth hearing regardless of the historical questions that surround it. Because even if some of the text was shaped by later hands, the core of it carries a weight that is hard to dismiss. It reads like the confession of a man who was trying to make sense of something that had happened to him, something that had disturbed him in a way he did not know how to process through the normal channels of Roman administration. It reads like a man who needed to write it down simply because he could not carry it alone anymore. Close your eyes if you can. Let your breathing slow. Let the day release its hold on you. And come with me into the mind of a Roman governor 2,000 years ago as he tries to explain to the most powerful man in the world what happened in a small corner of the empire when an unusual prisoner was brought before him for judgment. We begin with Pilate himself, because to understand the letter, you need to understand the man. Pontius Pilate was the Roman prefect of Judea from roughly the year 26 to 36 of the Common Era. He was not a prominent figure in the broader history of Rome. He did not command vast armies. He did not preside over the capital. He was a career civil servant, sent to govern a difficult province at the edge of the empire. A province filled with a people whose religious convictions made them notoriously hard to rule, whose traditions clashed repeatedly with Roman customs, and whose messianic expectations created a constant low-grade fear that rebellion might break out at any moment. Judea was not where ambitious Romans wanted to be posted. It was a punishment in some ways, or at least a test. If you could govern Judea without provoking a crisis that required imperial intervention, you might be rewarded with a better posting later. If you failed, if riots broke out, if blood was spilled in ways that reached the attention of Rome, your career could end permanently. Pilate knew this. Every decision he made was shaped by that awareness. He was not a cruel man by the standards of his time, but he was also not a merciful one. He was pragmatic. He was calculating. He was focused on survival, on keeping his position, on making it through his term of office without the kind of scandal that would cost him everything he had worked for. His headquarters were at Caesarea Maritima, a coastal city built by Herod the Great in grand Roman style, far from the intense religious atmosphere of Jerusalem. Pilate only traveled to Jerusalem during the major festivals, when the crowds swelled and the risk of unrest was highest. He hated going. He hated the tension. He hated the way the religious leaders would corner him with impossible demands. He hated the constant reminder that he was ruling over a people who did not want to be ruled by Rome, who saw him as a pagan intruder, and who would rather die than bow to the emperor's image. And every year during Passover, he had to go. He had to bring extra soldiers. He had to prepare for the worst. He had to make decisions that satisfied no one and offended everyone. It was exhausting. It was humiliating. And it was in exactly this atmosphere that, one spring morning, the chief priests brought a prisoner before him and demanded that he be executed. The prisoner was Jesus of Nazareth, a wandering teacher from the Galilee, a man whose fame had spread through the countryside, a man whose recent entry into Jerusalem on a donkey had caused crowds to shout messianic slogans and wave palm branches in the streets. The religious authorities wanted him dead, and they wanted Rome to do the killing so their hands would remain clean. What Pilate saw when he looked at this prisoner, this is where the letter begins. The Jesus described in the letter is not the Jesus of later Christian art. He is not the stylized figure of icons and cathedral windows, with hair the color of honey and robes that never wrinkle. He is something both more specific and more strange. He is a man Pilate had to look at with his own eyes, a man Pilate had to listen to with his own ears, a man Pilate had to describe in words that could be placed before the emperor without sounding ridiculous. The letter describes him as a man of noble bearing, tall, the text says, well proportioned, a man whose physical presence commanded attention not through force or aggression, but through a quiet dignity that Pilate had never encountered before in any prisoner he had judged. Think about what that means. Pilate had judged many men. In his years as prefect of Judea, he had sat on the judgment seat and listened to case after case. He had seen thieves and murderers. He had seen rebels and madmen. He had seen men who begged for their lives and men who cursed him to his face. He knew the range of human responses to imperial authority. He knew what fear looked like, and what arrogance looked like, and what resignation looked like. And he had never seen anything like what he saw in the face of this prisoner. None of the usual categories applied. The man was not afraid. He was not defiant. He was not resigned. He was something else. Something that had no name in the vocabulary of Roman jurisprudence. His hair, the letter says, was the color of a ripe chestnut, smooth at the top of his head, falling to his ears, and from his ears curling in waves down to his shoulders. His forehead was smooth and unlined. His face was not marked by the scars or creases that usually marked men who had lived hard lives in difficult times. His complexion was described as fair, with a slight reddish tint, healthy, alive, not the sallow pallor of someone who had been ill or malnourished. His beard was thick and matched the color of his hair, not overgrown, not wild, trimmed in the manner that suggested discipline rather than neglect. The letter specifically notes that his beard was slightly forked at the bottom, a detail so specific that it feels like something noticed by an eyewitness rather than invented by a later writer. It is the kind of detail you include when you are remembering a face, not when you are constructing one from imagination. It is the kind of detail that emerges from actual looking, from the kind of sustained attention that a Roman governor might give to a prisoner whose case had somehow caught his full attention, against all his intentions to stay detached. And then there were his eyes. Pilate writes that his eyes were striking, clear. The color was described as grayish blue, a detail that surprised some later readers, because it did not match the typical features of a Jewish man from the 1st century. But the letter insists on this detail and on what those eyes could do. They were sharp. They were piercing. They seemed to see through whatever they looked at. Pilate describes his gaze as gentle but penetrating, as capable of comforting a frightened child, but also of silencing a proud man with a single look. Consider the impossibility of this description. A Roman governor, trained to see prisoners as objects, as cases to be processed, as matters to be resolved and forgotten. A Roman governor writing to the emperor and describing the eyes of a condemned man as gentle and penetrating at the same time. Not weak and penetrating, not sad and penetrating, gentle. The word is almost embarrassing in an official Roman document. It is not the kind of word that a governor would use about a prisoner unless the word had somehow been forced out of him by what he had actually experienced in that courtroom. What is perhaps most remarkable about this description is that it is not merely visual. Pilate is not simply cataloging features the way an artist might study a face. He is describing something that affected him, something that did not fit into his normal categories of human assessment. He writes, in essence, that he looked at this man and felt two things at once: love and fear, tenderness and awe. The kind of response you might have to a person you desperately wanted to trust, combined with the kind of response you might have to someone whose inner life is so much larger than your own that you cannot fully meet their gaze. There is a word for this experience in the religious literature of many traditions. It is sometimes called the numinous, the sense that you are in the presence of something that belongs to a different order of being than yourself. It is a feeling that carries both attraction and a kind of holy terror. You want to draw near, and you want to fall to the ground. You want to be seen by this presence, and you want to hide from it. Pilate, whether he knew the word or not, was describing a numinous encounter. He was describing the experience of looking at a man and feeling, in the back of his administrative mind, that he was looking at something that should not have been there, something that had somehow arrived in his courtroom from a place he did not know existed. Breathe. Let that settle for a moment. A Roman governor, a hardened administrator, a man who had seen every kind of prisoner brought before him, murderers, thieves, insurrectionists, lunatics, frauds, writing to the Emperor of Rome and saying, in essence, that he had never seen a face like this one, that he could not stop thinking about it, that something in the eyes of this man had reached past every layer of his official role and touched something in him that he did not even know was still alive. This is not the normal content of Roman administrative correspondence. Roman governors wrote about taxes, troop movements, building projects, and legal disputes. They did not write about the physical beauty of condemned men. They did not describe the gentleness of a prisoner's gaze to the emperor. And the fact that this letter contains such a description, whether it was written by Pilate himself or by someone later trying to capture what Pilate might have felt, is itself a kind of testimony. Someone, somewhere, wanted the world to know that when Rome's representative looked at Jesus of Nazareth, he saw something that disturbed him, something that would not let him rest afterward, something that made the easy distance of imperial judgment suddenly feel unbearable. The letter moves from description of the body to description of the manner, and here the tone becomes even more intimate, even more unguarded. Pilate writes that no one had ever seen this man laugh, not because he was somber or harsh, but because his presence carried a weight that did not lend itself to casual mirth. He was not humorless. He could speak with warmth. He could embrace children. He could sit at table with ordinary people and make them feel at ease. But laughter, in the sense of loud public merriment, was not part of his manner. And yet, the letter says, many people had seen him weep. He had wept for the city of Jerusalem, looking out over its walls and mourning the destruction he could foresee. He had wept at the tomb of a friend named Lazarus, even though, the letter notes, as if still struggling with the memory, he was about to raise him from the dead. He had wept for the poor. He had wept for the lost. He had wept for those who rejected him even as he was trying to save them. Stop and consider what it means that the tears of Jesus were so distinctive that even Pilate had heard about them. Pilate was not part of Jesus' circle. He was not a follower. He had only ever seen Jesus once, in a courtroom, on the day of his sentencing. And yet by the time he sat down to write this letter, he had heard enough about this man, his teachings, his actions, his manner, that he could include in his report the observation that this prisoner was famous for weeping. That tells us something. It tells us that the tears of Jesus were not occasional. They were not private. They were a visible feature of his public life. They were noticed by enough people, often enough, that even a Roman administrator who barely interacted with him had absorbed the detail. The man was known, in his own province, as someone who wept openly for the suffering of others. And in a culture that prized stoic strength, that fact alone would have made him impossible to forget. This was not a man who laughed easily, but wept freely. In the normal Roman reckoning, such a man would be considered weak, emotional, unworthy of respect. Romans admired stoicism, the disciplined suppression of feeling in the name of duty and reason. A man who wept in public would be seen as less than fully masculine, as compromised in his dignity. And yet Pilate, writing of this, does not describe Jesus as weak. He describes him as possessed of a strange dignity that made his tears seem not a failure of composure, but an expression of something deeper than composure. The letter suggests that Jesus wept precisely because he could see what others could not. The suffering beneath the surface of every face, the grief hidden in every household, the slow tragedy of every human heart that had forgotten how to find its way home. And his tears were not a sign of his own pain alone. They were a sign of his compassion for the pain of everyone else. Imagine being seen by such a person. Imagine standing in front of someone whose vision of you was not based on your job title, your reputation, your social standing, or your usefulness, but on the deepest things in your heart, the things you have hidden even from yourself, the wounds you have learned to carry without complaint. Imagine being seen that completely, and instead of being judged, being wept for. Not pitied, wept for, the way a parent weeps for a child who has gone astray and does not yet know the way home. That is what it would have been like to stand in front of Jesus and feel his eyes settle on you. That is what Pilate was trying, in his fumbling administrative prose, to describe. The letter continues with descriptions of how Jesus spoke. His voice was calm, the text says, measured. When he taught, people listened not because he raised his voice, but because his words had a kind of authority that did not need volume to be heard. He did not argue. He did not flatter. He did not compromise. He spoke the truth as he saw it, and the truth as he spoke it had a weight that fell upon the listener like a cloak, soft, warm, heavy enough to change the shape of the day. And the people who heard him, not just the Jewish people, but the Romans who happened to be nearby, who wandered within earshot out of curiosity. The letter says that even they could not quite dismiss what they heard. Even hardened soldiers paused when he was speaking. Even proud officials felt a moment of disorientation, as if the ground beneath their conception of power was shifting slightly, and they did not know whether to resist the shift or let it carry them. There is something extraordinary in the testimony that Roman soldiers paused to listen. Soldiers were not philosophers. They were not religious seekers. They were trained to ignore the babbling of provincial preachers, to keep their ears closed against the strange teachings of conquered peoples, to focus on their orders and their next meal and the prospect of going home. And yet Pilate's letter describes them stopping in their tracks when this particular voice was speaking. Not to listen for sedition, not to listen for evidence, just to listen. Because something in the voice was reaching them in a place that their training had not prepared them for. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is the testimony that should make us pause. When even the empire's hardened tools of order are stopped by a single voice speaking quietly in a provincial street, you are no longer dealing with an ordinary teacher. You are dealing with something that does not fit any of the categories the empire knows how to use. Breathe. This is where the letter begins to reveal something about Pilate himself. Because a Roman governor who writes such things about a condemned prisoner is writing, whether he means to or not, a confession. He is telling the emperor that this man was not like the others. He is telling the emperor that the usual categories of judgment did not apply here. He is telling the emperor, in the careful language of a man who knows he is on dangerous ground, that something had happened to him when he looked into those grayish blue eyes, and he was not sure what to do about it. The next section of the letter turns to the political situation. Pilate wants the emperor to understand the context of what happened. He does not want his decision to be judged in isolation, without reference to the pressures that were bearing down on him. He writes of the fragile peace of Jerusalem during Passover. He writes of the crowds swelling the city. He writes of the constant tension between the Roman garrison and the Jewish population. He writes of the religious leaders whose influence over the people was enormous, and whose demands had to be taken seriously if order was to be maintained. There is something almost pitiful in the way the letter describes Pilate's situation. He had so few soldiers. The Roman garrison in Jerusalem during a normal week was modest, and even with reinforcements brought up for the Passover, he was still hopelessly outnumbered by the Jewish population. If a real uprising broke out, if the crowds turned from chanting into rioting, there was no realistic way for him to contain it without a slaughter that would echo all the way back to Rome and end his career. He lived in constant awareness of this vulnerability. Every public decision he made was shadowed by the fear that the wrong move would set off a chain reaction he could not stop. And the religious leaders knew this. They knew exactly how much pressure they could apply, exactly how to phrase their threats, exactly how to remind him that his political life depended on their cooperation. This is the context into which Jesus was brought. Not a calm courtroom in a peaceful province, a pressure cooker, a man on the edge of his own career, in a city on the edge of revolt, facing a crowd that had been carefully manipulated by leaders who wanted a specific outcome. And he writes something striking about his initial assessment of Jesus. He says that when the religious leaders first brought this man to him with charges of sedition, the charge of claiming to be a king, of threatening the authority of Caesar, of stirring up rebellion, Pilate examined him carefully. He questioned him. He listened to his answers, and he could find no evidence that the charges were true. Jesus, according to the letter, did not preach armed resistance to Rome. He did not gather followers for military action. He did not speak against Caesar in the way a rebel would. When asked directly about taxes, whether it was lawful to pay them to the emperor, he gave an answer that Pilate found not only acceptable, but actually wise. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. This was not the answer of a revolutionary. This was the answer of a man who understood that political authority and divine authority were operating on different levels, and that it was possible to honor both without betraying either. Pilate writes that he was impressed by the answer, that he had expected defiance and had received instead a clarity that sounded almost like wisdom itself. He writes that he had allowed Jesus to teach openly in Jerusalem, that he had not restricted his movements, that he had not arrested him when he gathered crowds, that he had not silenced him when he criticized the religious leaders. Pilate presents himself in the letter as a reasonable Roman governor who had extended to this man a degree of freedom that he would not have granted to any actual political threat. Think about that. In an occupied province where every public gathering was watched, where every charismatic teacher was a potential threat, where the Roman intelligence apparatus monitored everything that might foreshadow rebellion. In that environment, Jesus had been allowed to gather crowds, teach openly, name disciples, and travel from town to town, all without any restriction from the imperial authorities. That is not how Rome treated suspected rebels. That is not even how Rome treated men whose political loyalties were unclear. The fact that Jesus had operated freely under Pilate's watch is itself a piece of evidence about how Pilate had viewed him from the beginning, not as a threat, not as a danger, as something else, something Pilate could not quite name, but something that had earned a kind of cautious respect. And his point in writing this seems to be, I did not want to condemn him. I did not see him as dangerous to Rome. The decision was forced upon me. I was trapped by the circumstances. This is the voice of a man who is trying to explain himself, not to the emperor alone, but perhaps also to himself. It is the voice of someone who knows, on some level, that what happened should not have happened, and who is scrambling to construct a narrative that allows him to live with it. The religious leaders, he says, were insistent. They demanded death. They threatened that if he did not act, they would report him to Rome as a governor who refused to punish a man claiming to be a king, a charge that could end his career and possibly his life. Pilate writes that he tried to release Jesus. He offered to release him under the Passover custom of freeing one prisoner at the people's request. The crowd, stirred up by the leaders, chose Barabbas, a genuine insurrectionist, a murderer instead. Pilate writes of his frustration, his sense of injustice, his awareness that he was being used as a tool by men whose motives he did not trust. He writes of the moment when he finally made the decision, the moment when he publicly washed his hands in a basin of water and declared that he was innocent of this man's blood. It was a gesture borrowed from Jewish custom, meant to signal that the responsibility lay with those who had demanded the execution, not with him. But the letter makes clear that the gesture did not work, not in his own conscience. The water washed his hands, but it did not wash the memory of those eyes, and it did not wash away the feeling that he had just participated in something that no amount of political justification could erase. Breathe. Let this settle. We are listening to a man who was trying to justify what could not be justified, who was attempting, from the distance of an official letter, to make a case for himself that he could barely believe. Every line of the letter carries the shadow of his own doubt. Every explanation carries the weight of what he knew he should have done differently. He presents himself as trapped, but in his telling, the trap is clearly of his own making. He had the authority to release Jesus. He had the power to override the crowd. He had Rome behind him. And he chose, in the end, to bend to pressure rather than stand for what he believed was right. This is not unique to Pilate. This is the pattern of almost every moral failure in human history. A person of some power, faced with a clear choice, knows what is right and chooses what is safe instead, and spends the rest of their life writing letters to themselves, to others, to the emperor, to God, trying to explain why it was impossible to do otherwise. But Pilate's letter does not stop with the trial and the sentence. It goes further. It describes what happened after, and this is where it becomes, in some sense, most remarkable of all. Because a Roman governor reporting on an execution would normally end his report with the execution itself. The prisoner was sentenced. The prisoner was crucified. The prisoner died. End of report. Move on to the next administrative matter. But Pilate's letter does not end there. It continues. It describes phenomena that he cannot fit into the normal categories of Roman experience, phenomena that he felt obligated to report even though he knew they would sound impossible to anyone reading them in Rome. He writes that at the hour of the crucifixion, darkness fell over the whole land. This was not a normal darkness. It was not the result of a passing storm or a cloud cover. It was a sudden, profound darkening of the sun that began around the middle of the day and lasted for hours. He writes that the stars appeared in the middle of the afternoon, that the moon took on a color resembling blood, that ordinary people in the streets were terrified and ran for shelter. Try to imagine receiving such a report as a Roman bureaucrat in the imperial archives, a governor of a provincial region writing about the sun darkening at midday, about stars appearing when stars should not appear, about the moon turning the color of blood. These are not the kinds of details you invent for a routine report.
They are the kinds of details you include only because you witnessed them, because they were witnessed by everyone around you, because you knew that omitting them would be a more glaring oddity than including them. The letter is unmistakable on this point. Something happened in the sky over Jerusalem on the day of the crucifixion that no Roman observer could explain by reference to ordinary natural phenomena. He writes of an earthquake. The ground shook, stones split open, buildings were damaged, and in the temple of the Jews, the most sacred structure in the city, the great curtain that separated the most holy space from the rest of the building was torn from top to bottom. Pilate does not claim to have seen this himself, but he reports it because it was being spoken of everywhere in the aftermath of the execution, and because the religious implications were being debated in every street corner and every marketplace. The torn curtain mattered. To the Jewish people, that curtain was not just a piece of fabric. It was the symbolic boundary between the presence of God and the rest of the world. Only the high priest was allowed to pass beyond it, and only once a year, on the Day of Atonement, with elaborate purification rituals. To say that this curtain had been torn from top to bottom was to say something theologically explosive. The barrier between God and humanity had been removed.
The way into the holy place had been opened. The exclusive access of the priesthood had been ended in a single moment by a force that no human hand could have applied. Pilate may not have understood the theology of this, but he understood enough to know that the news of the torn curtain was rocking the religious world of his province in a way that nothing else had ever done. And then, even more remarkably, he writes that in the days following the execution, reports began to reach him of the dead rising from their tombs and being seen by people in the city. He does not confirm these reports personally. He writes as an administrator, recording what was being said, what was being claimed, what was disturbing the peace of his province in ways that defied every ordinary explanation. This is one of the strangest details in the entire letter, and it has a parallel in the Gospel of Matthew, which records the same phenomenon. After Jesus' death, Matthew says, the tombs of many holy people were opened, and after his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and appeared to many in the city. It is one of the most cryptic passages in all of Scripture, mentioned briefly and never explained. But it appears here too in Pilate's letter as a phenomenon that was being widely reported in the aftermath of the execution. Two independent sources, one from the Gospel writers, one from the desk of the Roman governor, describing the same impossible thing. Make of that what you will, but do not dismiss it too quickly. The pattern of independent witness is one of the foundations of historical evidence, and here it appears in a place where you would least expect to find it. And finally, he writes of the empty tomb. According to the letter, he had posted a guard at the tomb of Jesus after the execution. This much is consistent with the gospel accounts. The religious leaders had asked for guards to prevent the disciples from stealing the body and claiming a resurrection. Pilate had granted the request, and on the third day, the tomb was found empty. The guards reported that a great light had appeared, that the stone had rolled away, that they had been unable to resist what happened, and that the body was gone. Pilate does not know what to make of this. He writes, in a line that has struck readers for centuries, that since these events occurred, he has felt that the gods have abandoned this province. It is an extraordinary sentence from a Roman governor. The gods of Rome were supposed to be everywhere, protecting the empire, supporting its officials, maintaining the order of the world.
For a governor to write that the gods had abandoned his province is to admit a kind of cosmic disorientation that no bureaucratic language can fully capture. It is also, perhaps, the wrong interpretation. Read closely. The line carries the weight of a man who has misread what happened to him. The gods, in his view, had abandoned the province because something terrible had taken place there. The order of the world had been broken, and the divine presence had withdrawn in disgust or in grief. But there is another way to read those events. Maybe the gods of Rome had not abandoned anything. Maybe the gods of Rome had simply been overshadowed. Maybe the God of Israel, the one true God whom the Jewish people worshipped, had stepped into the world in a way that made every other god look small. And maybe Pilate, sitting in his office in Caesarea, was feeling not the absence of the divine, but the overwhelming presence of a divine he did not yet know how to recognize. He had participated in something. He did not know what, but he knew at some level beneath the level of official reporting that the rules of the world had shifted. The man he had condemned was not where he had been left. The tomb was empty. The signs in the heavens had been unmistakable. And whatever had happened, it was not something that could be corrected by another round of Roman administrative procedure. The letter, as we have it, ends not with a resolution, but with a troubled silence. Pilate has nothing more to add. He has described what he saw. He has described what he did. He has described what followed. And the emperor, if he ever read this letter, was left to draw his own conclusions. History does not tell us whether Tiberius read it. There are legends, some of them quite old, that the letter caused the emperor to reconsider Jesus of Nazareth, even to propose that Jesus be added to the Roman pantheon of recognized deities. These stories are almost certainly later embellishments, not history. But the letter itself, whether authentic or shaped by later hands, captures something essential about the human response to an encounter with the divine.
Pilate did not become a believer. The letter does not record a conversion. There is no moment in the text where he kneels before the risen Christ and declares him Lord. He remains to the end a Roman administrator, caught between duty and conscience, between politics and something deeper than politics. He did what governors do. He filed his report. He moved on to the next crisis. But something in him had been marked. Something had been permanently altered. And the fact that the letter exists at all, the fact that someone, whether Pilate himself or an early Christian writer trying to imagine what Pilate would have said, felt compelled to put these words on paper and preserve them across centuries, is itself a kind of witness. The witness is this: when you stand close to the divine, when you see it face to face, you do not walk away unchanged. Even if you do not believe, even if you do not fall on your knees, even if you continue to go about your ordinary business afterward, something in you has been touched, and the touch does not fade. This is one of the most important truths the letter preserves for us. The divine encounter does not depend on the response of the one who encounters it. The light shines whether you welcome it or not. The voice speaks whether you choose to listen or not. The presence is present whether you acknowledge it or not. And the marks that such an encounter leaves on a soul are real, regardless of what theological framework the soul uses to interpret them. Pilate did not have the words for what happened to him. He did not have the categories. He did not have the faith, but he had the experience. and the experience worked on him from the inside, slowly, quietly, in the years that followed, in ways that no amount of imperial duty could fully suppress. How many people in our own time have had similar experiences and have not known what to do with them? How many have stood at the edge of something they could not name, felt themselves touched by a presence they could not explain, and gone back to their work with the feeling that they had just been seen in a way they had not been seen before? How many have written their own version of Pilate's letter, not on parchment, but in the private journals of their hearts, in the conversations they cannot quite have with anyone else, in the tears that come without warning at certain hours of the night? The letter of Pilate is not just the testimony of one Roman governor. It is the testimony of every soul that has ever come close to the divine without knowing what was happening to them. It is a mirror that reflects something common in human experience, the encounter that exceeds our categories and the bewildered attempt to make sense of it afterward. You may have written your own version of this letter. You may not have used parchment or Latin or formal address to an emperor, but somewhere in your life, something has happened to you that you have never been able to fully explain, and you have carried it ever since. And tonight, perhaps, is the night when that experience comes back to you with a new clarity. Perhaps tonight is the night when you understand, finally, that what happened to you was not random. It was not coincidence. It was the same presence that touched a Roman governor in a courtroom in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, reaching out across the centuries to touch you in your own room, in your own time, in your own particular need. Breathe. Now, for centuries, some scholars dismissed Pontius Pilate as a figure of legend. He appeared in the Gospels, yes. He was mentioned in the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus, but there was no physical evidence of his existence, no inscription, no coin, no carved name that could be pointed to as proof. For the skeptics, this was a serious argument. The Gospels mention many historical figures, kings, governors, high priests, and most of them have left some trace in the archaeological or numismatic record. But Pilate, the most consequential character in the entire crucifixion narrative, was strangely absent from the physical evidence. For nearly 2,000 years, his existence rested entirely on textual sources. And textual sources, as every historian knows, are easier to challenge than stones. Then, in the year 1961, something changed.
Archaeologists were excavating the ancient Roman theater at Caesarea Maritima, the very city where Pilate had his headquarters, the coastal city built by Herod the Great. In the theater, among the ruins of the stone seats and the staging area, they found a limestone block that had been reused as a step in a later construction. The block had been cut down from its original size, the face partially damaged, but when they turned it over and examined it, they saw Latin letters carved into the stone. They cleaned it carefully, they studied the inscription, and what they found was nothing less than a direct confirmation of what the Gospels had been claiming for 2,000 years. The inscription named Pontius Pilate. It identified him as prefect of Judea. It commemorated his construction of a building called the Tiberium, a structure he had apparently built to honor the Emperor Tiberius, the very emperor to whom this letter we have been discussing was supposedly addressed. Think about the layered significance of this discovery for a moment. The stone does not only confirm Pilate's existence, it confirms his exact title, prefect, not the later term procurator that some sources had used and that critics had called anachronistic.
It confirms his connection to Tiberius, the emperor named in the letter we have been discussing. It confirms that he was actively building public structures in Caesarea, in the very city where his administrative headquarters were located, exactly as the historical record had claimed. Every detail that scholars had been able to pull from textual sources was suddenly anchored in a piece of carved limestone that no one could deny. The man was real. His title was correct. His relationship to Tiberius was real. His presence in Caesarea was real. The whole architecture of the historical Pilate, which skeptics had been chipping away at for centuries, was suddenly placed on solid ground that could not be moved. The Pilate stone, as it came to be called, was the first and remains the only direct archaeological evidence of Pilate's existence. And its discovery sent a shock through biblical scholarship. The man who had condemned Jesus was no longer a figure who might or might not have existed. He was a man whose name had been carved in stone in the very century of his governance. He had commissioned a building. He had honored his emperor. He had left a mark on the landscape of the province he ruled. He had been real. You can see the stone today. It is displayed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, where visitors stand quietly in front of it, reading the worn Latin letters, contemplating the weight of what this small block of limestone represents. It does not prove that the letter we have been discussing is authentic. It does not prove that Jesus rose from the dead. It does not answer every question, but it answers one question, and it answers it definitively. The governor described in the Gospels was a historical figure. The trial described in the Gospels was presided over by a real man with a real name who built real buildings, who sent real reports to Rome. The story is not a legend. The story is rooted in fact, and the stone is the silent witness to that fact. There is something fitting about this. Jesus himself once told his critics, when they tried to silence the crowds who were praising him, that if the people were silenced, the very stones would cry out. And 2,000 years later, a stone has cried out. It has cried out the name of Pontius Pilate. It has cried out the fact of his governance. And by doing so, it has cried out indirectly the truth of everything the Gospels claimed about the events of that particular Passover. This pattern has repeated itself many times in biblical archaeology. Names that were dismissed as legendary have been confirmed by inscriptions. Cities that were thought to be fictional have been excavated. Events that were considered mythological have been corroborated by independent historical sources. Each discovery is a small voice added to the chorus of stones that are slowly, patiently, refusing to stay silent. The archaeologists do not set out to prove the Bible. They set out to find what is there. And what they keep finding, again and again, is that what is there matches what the ancient writers said was there. The correlation is not perfect. There are still mysteries. There are still debates. But the trajectory is unmistakable, and it points in the direction of confirmation rather than refutation. The Pilate stone is one of the most powerful examples of this pattern. Because of all the figures in the New Testament, Pilate was perhaps the easiest to dismiss as mythological, a Roman foil for the divine drama, a symbolic stand-in for worldly power, a name borrowed from political imagination to give the crucifixion the appearance of historical specificity. But he was none of those things.
He was a real man who left a real inscription in a real city on a real coast that you can stand in front of today and read with your own eyes. And every time you remember that, the rest of the gospel story becomes harder to push aside as mere legend. Breathe. Let your body relax more deeply. We are approaching the end of this journey, but there is no hurry. The letter has been opened, the governor has spoken, the stone has cried out. And what remains is to consider what all of this means for you, lying here tonight, listening to a story that has traveled across 2 millennia to reach you. Why does this letter matter? Not because it is canonical scripture. It is not. The Church never accepted it as part of the New Testament, and there are good reasons to be cautious about attributing every line of it to Pilate himself. The questions about its origins are real and they are unresolved. So why then does it still speak? It speaks because it captures something that the Gospels, for all their power, do not emphasize in quite the same way. The Gospels show us Jesus through the eyes of those who loved him. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, these are the witnesses of faith, the men who followed Jesus and who wrote down what they remembered because they wanted the world to know the one they had come to believe was the Son of God. But Pilate's letter, whoever actually composed it, shows us Jesus through the eyes of someone who did not believe, or at least through the eyes of someone whose belief was incomplete, complicated, struggling. It shows us Jesus as he might have appeared to a man who had every reason to see him as just another troublesome prisoner, and who, despite that, could not quite do so. It shows us that the power of Jesus was not limited to those who already trusted him. It reached into the offices of those who tried to sentence him, and it left its mark even there. This is important, because the encounter with the divine is not reserved for the faithful. The faithful are often the ones who recognize it most clearly, most quickly, with the most joy. But even those who do not recognize it, even those who turn away from it, or bury it under the demands of their daily lives, or explain it away in the morning light, even they are sometimes touched by something they cannot fully name, and the touch lingers. It changes how they see the world. It keeps them awake at night. It forces them to write letters to emperors, or to write journals to themselves, or to simply sit in silence wondering what it all means. Maybe that is where you are tonight, not a faithful disciple standing at the empty tomb in the garden, maybe more like Pilate, a person trying to do their job, trying to meet their obligations, trying to keep their life on track, and yet haunted by the memory of a face, a voice, a presence that will not quite let them go. Maybe you have felt something that you cannot explain. Maybe you have turned away from it, and yet it has followed you. Maybe you are here tonight, listening to a story about a Roman governor who could not forget a pair of grayish blue eyes, because something in you recognizes the experience of being unable to forget. That recognition is itself important. It is not nothing. It is not a coincidence. The fact that you are still listening, still paying attention, still drawn to a story about a man you may or may not believe in, that fact is itself a quiet form of testimony. Something in you is still open. Something in you is still capable of being moved. Something in you has not yet hardened to the point where the divine cannot reach you. And as long as that is true, the door is still open. The conversation is not finished. The encounter that Pilate had on a single morning in his courtroom can still happen to you, in the quiet of a single night, in the privacy of your own heart, in the space between waking and sleeping, where the deepest things tend to come to the surface. The letter does not tell you what to do with that experience. It does not preach. It does not demand a conversion. It simply records. It says, "I saw this man. I could not dismiss him. Something happened that I do not understand. And I felt afterward
that the gods had left this place.
Maybe the truth is the opposite. Maybe the gods had not left. Maybe, for the first time in a very long while, a god had actually arrived. And Pilate had witnessed the arrival without understanding what he was seeing. Breathe deeply. The same God who was present in that courtyard 2,000 years ago is present here tonight. The same presence that made a Roman governor write a confession he did not fully understand is available to anyone who is willing to sit in the quiet and acknowledge that something bigger than their daily concerns is moving through their life. The same voice that spoke to the religious leaders and the Roman administrators and the crowds in the street is still speaking. In a quieter tone now, in a less dramatic form, but still speaking. The question is not whether the voice is real. The question is whether you are willing to listen. Pilate listened in his way. He listened badly. He made the wrong choice. He bent to political pressure when he should have stood firm. But even in his failure, he listened enough to know that something extraordinary had happened, enough to put pen to parchment and try to capture what he had seen, enough to carry the memory of those eyes for the rest of his life. There is even an old tradition, though it is not history, it is only legend, that says Pilate was eventually called back to Rome and stripped of his office, that his career ended in disgrace, that he died by his own hand under the weight of what he had done. We cannot verify these stories. The historical record on his final years is thin and contradictory, but the legends themselves carry a kind of truth. They tell us how the early generations of Christians imagined the inner life of the man who had washed his hands of their Lord. They imagined that the washing had not worked, that the water had failed to do what he had hoped it would do, that the memory of those eyes had stayed with him until the end, and had eventually broken him in ways no political success could have repaired. Whether or not the legends are accurate, their lesson is unmistakable. There is no neutral position in front of Jesus. You cannot wash your hands and walk away. The hand washing only multiplies the responsibility, because it forces you to acknowledge in public what your conscience already knows in private, that you saw what was right and chose what was easier. Pilate's gesture, intended to absolve him, has become the symbol of moral cowardice for 2,000 years. Every time someone in any culture, any century, any walk of life tries to evade responsibility for a decision they know was wrong, the phrase comes back, "He washed his hands of it." The very ritual that Pilate hoped would erase him from the story has instead permanently inscribed his name into the conscience of the world. You can listen better. You do not have to make his mistake. You do not have to compromise under pressure. You do not have to hand over what is precious to you in exchange for temporary peace. You can stand in the presence of the divine with open hands and an honest heart, and you can say, "I am here. I am listening. Show me what you would have me see." And the divine, which is always more patient than we imagine, will meet you where you are. The letter of Pilate ends in troubled silence, but your own story does not have to end there. Your own encounter with the one Pilate could not forget can end in something different. It can end in peace. It can end in rest. It can end in the quiet assurance that even in the middle of a confused and difficult life, there is a presence that knows you, sees you, loves you, and will not let you go. 2,000 years ago, a man in a Roman robe sat down and tried to explain to his emperor what had happened in his courtroom. He did not fully understand it. He did not know how to resolve the contradictions. But he could not stop writing. He could not stop trying. And somehow, across the long centuries, his words have reached this moment, this room, this breath. They have reached you. Breathe. Let your body sink a little deeper. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of the day finally slip away. The face that Pilate could not forget is the same face that is meeting you tonight in the silence between heartbeats. The eyes that held him even while he condemned them are holding you now in a gaze that is not condemnation, but invitation. The gentle dignity that no Roman official could dismiss is present here, in this room, in this moment, offering the same thing it has always offered: presence, peace, the quiet certainty that you are known and you are not alone. If you take nothing else from this story tonight, take this. The same God whose face Pilate described in his letter is the God who has been drawing near to you long before you knew his name. The same God whose death shook the earth and whose resurrection emptied a tomb is the God whose love has been waiting at the edges of your life, patiently, persistently, without giving up on you, even when you have given up on yourself. He is still here. He has never left. And tonight, as you rest, you can allow yourself to be held by him, not as a theological exercise, not as a religious duty, but as a simple act of trust. The kind of trust that says, I have carried enough today. Tonight, I will let someone bigger than me carry me. This is the invitation of the letter, not to study, not to debate, but to rest. To rest in the presence of the one whose face a Roman governor could not forget, whose death changed the world, whose resurrection is the answer to every sealed tomb in every human life. If this story touched something in you tonight, if the letter of Pontius Pilate made you pause or reflect, or simply feel a little closer to a presence you cannot quite name, then you understand why Sacred Psalms exists. This channel is dedicated to exploring the deepest, most mysterious, and most personal passages in Scripture and in the records that surround it. We move slowly. We take the time these stories deserve. We do not rush toward easy conclusions. If that kind of journey resonates with you, subscribe. It is the simplest way to make sure you do not miss what comes next. And there is so much more to explore. Lost letters, forgotten witnesses, ancient voices that are still speaking to those who have ears to hear them. If you want to go deeper still, consider joining the channel. And if this video brought you something real, if it helped you rest, if it helped you think, if it simply gave you a moment of peace at the end of a long day, it tells us that this kind of content matters, that there is still a place in the world for slow, thoughtful, honest exploration of the ancient texts. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to the end. And one last question for you to carry into sleep. If you had been Pilate that day, sitting in the judgment seat, looking into the face of the man they had brought before you, what do you think you would have seen? What do you think you would have done? Leave your answer in the comments, because after 2,000 years, this question is still worth asking, and every honest answer brings us one step closer to the truth. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you, and may you rest tonight in the presence of the one whom even a Roman governor could not forget. This is Sacred Psalms. Sleep well, and may the angels of heaven guard your rest. Amen.